Social Contract, a work of statist legal fiction.
Okay, another episode of Bad Philosophy with Rock and Mr. E. We're going to talk about the social contract theory today. Libertarians tend to hate the social contract theory, while at the same time a lot of their arguments that they make about rights and values and things would actually be better argued for with the social contract theory. It's very confusing. A lot of people have pointed that out about some of the libertarians on YouTube, that their arguments are actually social contract arguments, but yet at the same time they want to deny the social contract theory. So it's very interesting. So let's get started.
One of the most widespread theories in today's Western culture is the social contract, where each of us is bound by an agreement to the state. Many believe the social contract can't be opted out of, elevating it to infallible heights, while appeals to popularity make it unacceptable to feel that the individual is not bound by this concept.
Okay, a major problem with social contract theory is that it cannot be opted out of. That is actually a problem. It's something that we discuss a lot in philosophy, political philosophy. When we talk about social contract theory, it is a major problem that you can't opt out of it. If you're born into society, you are just bound by the contract of that society if you are born in that society. So it is actually a problem. It's probably the biggest problem for social contract theory. Now, Rockin' Mr. E is a anarcho-capitalist, so that has problems that are way bigger than that. But he is correct in saying that's a major problem. Now, when he's talking about an appeal to popularity, he seems to be specifically talking about democracy. Now, he has a video about democracy, and that will be what the next episode is, so they're connected. I'll try to get that one up as soon as possible following this one, because they're very closely connected when he talks about democracy. But if you're born into a society, and it's a democratic society, then you have about as much ability to influence that society as your vote does, theoretically. Though in a capitalist society, as much money as you are born into gives you much more influence over it. So there isn't really a lot of stupidity right off the bat. Normally he starts off by saying something incredibly stupid, but he actually brings up some good points. But the stupidity's coming, just wait.
Parallels can be drawn to the way that authoritarianism is typically based on the notion that the individual is subservient to entities like a deity, collective, or some sort of group masquerading as experts.
Now here he's trying to say that that democracy is like totalitarianism. Is basically what he's saying. Not really true. Locke is a social contract theorist. He believed in a Republican version of democracy. There's still rights in Locke's idea. Democracy would not work without a concept of rights, which is like how our democracy in the United States works. It's how most democracies now around the world work. There's a concept of rights built in, and separation of powers, and all those things. Like, there are things that keep it from being just a authoritarian, or he likes to say appeal to popularity, which is a logical fallacy, which democracy is not that logical fallacy, but I will wait until I do his video on democracy before I explain it.
The social contract is such a common misconception among those attempting to refute the unalienable rights of the individual that I feel it's necessary to tackle it head-on to once and for all demonstrate just how flawed it actually is.
Yeah, don't hold your breath. He's not going to really show you any kind of flaws of social contract theory, which, once again, almost all versions of social contract theory have rights, with the exception of Hobbes' version. In fact, he just attacks Hobbes' version, if you really think about it.
The social contract is a generic term of which several philosophers have attempted to define. Put simply, the social contract is an agreement between the collective and the individual, where terms and conditions must be respected. If these are not kept to, then there are various familiar consequences for failure, like a fine or imprisonment. Three philosophers in particular are the basis for modern social contract theory. The first of these philosophers is Thomas Hobbes, who was very pessimistic about life without the state. He believed that this would be so miserable that people had little choice but to sacrifice their freedom for state protection.
Hobbes is the originator of social contract theory. What he argues for as the perfect form of government is monarchy by a benevolent monarch, a benevolent sovereign. That is his version of it. And he starts from a thought experiment called the state of nature. Many people, including Rocking Mr. E, tend to take the state of nature very literally. I don't know how literally Hobbes really expected you to take it, but Hobbes had seen like Civil War and Europe and just horrible, horrible things, so it's perhaps true he took it literally. But it doesn't really work if you take it literally. And that's the that's one of the main problems with Hobbes's version of ethics in general, as Hume pointed out, that it's a naturalistic fallacy. Like ethics do not correspond to naturalness. So there's tons of problems with Hobbes's version, and his argues basically that people give up some of their freedom to the state in exchange for security, because life in the state of nature is so horrible, nasty, brutish, and short, as he's famous for saying, that you give up some of your rights to a sovereign for protection. Because if we exist in a society, then we are more protected. Whereas outside of a society in the state of nature, anyone can come and take our stuff. Anyone can come and kill us. Anyone can come and rape us. Just all they need is to be more powerful than us to do it. To have better weapons, to be more physically powerful, or some other kind of power to have over us.
This leads to a highly authoritarian definition of the social contract, where the individual is bound by whatever rulers decree. The second philosopher is John Locke, who believed that the individual has an unalienable right to freedom, which can't be violated without reprisal. Thus, the collective has no legitimacy unless it serves to protect the unalienable right of the individual. Both Hobbes and Locke are philosophers I've mentioned several times before, and John Locke's philosophy of unalienable natural rights is one that I'm personally inspired by.
Now, despite the fact that Locke believes in natural inalienable rights, he still is a social contract theorist, and he still believes in democracy, which libertarians reject, and Rockin' Mr. E specifically rejects. Locke was wrong about democracy in some ways, in that he thought that people would respect others' rights to the point where nobody would ever use their democratic power to violate other people's rights, because they'd realize that in democracy you may be the majority now, but that may not be true in the future. He thought people would just respect each other's rights in democracy, which he was wrong about. We have that problem now with democracy. A good example would be kind of like the way conservatives are about gay marriage. Now, that should be a right. That should be a right that gay people have. Yet, when the courts have overturned democratic votes, that suddenly the right wing, who are so much about rights, suddenly go, but the will of the people is being violated. That's what they start saying. Once it doesn't go their way, they start crying like babies, because we don't vote on rights in a democracy, which is one of the things that allows democracy to work. It's either a right or it's not. We don't vote on rights. So there really isn't this huge conflict between the two things that Rockin' Mr. E seems to think there is. The only problem is rights need to be enforced by something. I believe that rights are independent of the state. They're not privileges given, which he accuses people of doing before, but the state has to enforce them. Like, some entity has to enforce them. Like, you can't just like, poof, magic, like my magic powers that make you unable to violate my rights.
The third of the foundational philosophers of modern state thought is one I've discussed a lot less, though is arguably the most popular, at least in a delusional sense of what some feel they stand for. Jean-Jacques Rousseau, the 18th century Genevan philosopher, believed that the social contract between the individual and the state is based on a set of terms and conditions. If any party breaks this contract unjustly, then they can be punished, though theoretically this applies equally to authority as it does to citizenry. Rousseau believed that under certain instances one could exit a social contract, but overall felt that individual happiness was secondary to the collective will.
Notice how he calls people who believe in Rousseau's version of social contract delusional while never giving an argument what's wrong with it. He will go into it, though, but he doesn't understand Rousseau. Rousseau, when he talks about being able to exit the social contract, Rousseau believes in city-states. Like, the whole idea of, like, kind of states' rights would seem to, like, be from Rousseau. The idea that if you don't like what's going on in this state, you can go to another state. And, so the whole idea of states' rights, which is an idea that conservatives have latched onto, it comes from Rousseau. So it's not just all like Rousseau is the liberal one and Locke is the conservative one, though you can kind of, that works in a general sense. Just like I said in a previous video that Plato and Aristotle, one is kind of the religious thinker and one's the scientific thinker. That works in a general sense. You can say Rousseau's the liberal and Locke is the conservative, but their actual, when you get down to their actual philosophy, you have to think a little bit more than just like those simple dichotomies when you're talking about them.
We live in an era of the largest states in human history, so it's unsurprising that authority indoctrinates the individual into believing we're one big happy collective family, bound by the mutually beneficial terms of a Rousseauian social contract. Even the United States, the only country to come close to the Lockean social contract, has gradually moved towards Rousseau's interpretation. We live in a time far more akin to a Hobbesian social contract than many would care to admit, which is bad enough, but it's not as though Rousseau's social contract doesn't have serious flaws when set apart from Thomas Hobbes. While Rousseau's social contract may seem benign, since individuals working towards collective goals could be perceived as virtuous, in actuality, Rousseau had an authoritarian streak. He believed that individuals must be forced to be free through collective rule, a contradictory position.
Okay, he talks about that being a contradiction, and I've explained this before when I talked about free will in previous videos. The Rousseau idea is that you're more free in a society than in the state of nature. Locke says you're more free in the state of nature than in a society. He obviously agrees with Locke because he's an anarcho-capitalist. So he believes like absolutely no regulation and no government and we just trade voluntarily would make us more free. Except that Rousseau believes that, yeah, a society where you have, say, government healthcare, government education, libraries, roads, actually makes you more free because you don't have to spend so much time worrying about survival and you can pursue other things. That is the idea of you being free. It amazes me that people don't understand this. Like, I don't even know if he understands it at all or if he just understands it and rejects it. Because it sounds like he doesn't actually understand it because he calls it contradictory. But in order to show that that's contradictory, you would have to explain it. Because of course you have more autonomy in a society. Like, I wouldn't have time to do this if I lived in a anarcho-capitalist world. I wouldn't have time to make these videos. I wouldn't have time to watch videos. I wouldn't have time to do the writing I do. I wouldn't have time to do all the other stuff I do. In fact, my job would not even probably exist. The things I wanted to study probably wouldn't exist because they don't have direct benefits to survival. And I made this this criticism of Ayn Rand's philosophy too, and the Randians say, oh, that's a misunderstanding of her philosophy. And I was like, well, then explain it to me. If it's not just about survival, if only things that have to do with survival don't have value in Ayn Rand's world, and other things such as philosophy and things would have value, explain how they have value in her society. And no one has ever done it. They've never even attempted to do it. Like, if someone attempted to do it, and I would tell you what their arguments were, and perhaps I just don't understand them. But no one's even attempted to do it. So if someone watching this video who's a Randian or a Libertarian, please explain it to me, because no one has even attempted to do it. And that makes me think that you know you're wrong, if you can't even attempt to do it. And one more note, I actually agree with Rock and Mr. E that we are sometimes close to a Hobbesian version of a social contract theory, which the Hobbesian version is very scary. Because in the U.S., after 9/11, we went full-on Hobbes. Like the Patriot Act and invading Iraq, it was full-on Hobbes. It was like, Bush, whatever you want to do, you're the sovereign. We don't care about our rights. Just keep us safe, Bush. Keep us safe. It was exactly Hobbes. It was straight out Hobbes. So, and that's scary, and I'm against that.
He went as far as stating that collective rule was indivisible and unalienable, which is the exact opposite of John Locke, who believed that the individual was the one truly entitled to unalienable and indivisible rights. Rousseau believed that his version of collective rule should always be a direct democracy, and that no one had the right to stand in the way of the rule of the people. This philosophical line of inquiry was later developed by Karl Marx, who believed in the dictatorship of the proletariat, a form of authoritarianism by collective approval. Unsurprisingly, Rousseau has become very popular with modern collectivists, particularly socialists, who often argue for direct democracy.
Okay, there is one similarity between Marx and Rousseau, other than like the similarities that Marx has with Locke. Because I once wrote a paper called Democratic Principles in Locke and Rousseau. Locke and Marx. I once wrote a paper on that where I showed that Locke and Marx, who everyone thinks is like radically different from each other, are actually have a lot of similarities. And some other people, like libertarians, actually reject some of the things that even Locke and Marx agreed on, which is kind of weird. But the one thing that Rousseau and Marx have in common, that Locke and Marx don't have in common, is this idea of small city-states, or competing governments. That's the one thing they have in common. So when he talks about Marx being influenced by Rousseau, like Marx wasn't really influenced by Rousseau, I don't think. I'd have to ask somebody I know who knows more about Marx than me, to be sure. Like knows more about his biography and things like that. Because I do know quite a bit about Marx, but I'm definitely not a Marx scholar, so I definitely couldn't tell you every single little detail about his life. So going on about Rousseau, Rousseau didn't believe in rights the way that Locke believed in rights. And Rousseau did believe in direct democracy, but once again, these are city-states. But it's not like you think democracy is. Rousseau had this concept called the general will, which would be the general will of the people. And it's a really hard concept to explain. I actually think it's a concept that works in theory and not in practice. I can't really understand how you would implement it. But it does have some similarities to how we in the U.S. Use the separation of powers and things like that in order to make sure we get the right answer. Because we don't really trust the people in the U.S. completely, the way the Constitution was drafted. But Rousseau's general will would be, we would throw out the really extreme views. Like the extreme view on one side and the extreme view on the other side, we'd throw them out. And we'd look for what people agreed on. And how it would work would be like, an example I would use is like gay marriage. I used that example before. There are people who believe, the real extreme view on marriage would be people who believe that only straight people should get married, and the people who believe that only gay people should get married, which I don't even know anyone like that. But that would be the two extreme views. So we throw those out. The actual consensus is that marriage is something that's okay for people to do, and it's a right. And there's no real difference between gay and straight marriage when you get down to it, in terms of what it does and its legal ramifications and all those things like that. So the consensus would be marriage. It's hard to explain. If anyone has any questions about the general will, I use that example because a friend of mine who is now getting his PhD in Ohio State in religious studies, it took me a long time to explain it to him. And I used the gay marriage example, and he goes, no, the consensus would be straight marriage. And I was like, no, that's in a regular democracy. This is the general will. Since the general will says that marriage is okay, then it's okay for everyone. That's what the general will would state. And it took me forever for him to understand it. But it is like Rousseau's way of accounting for rights and things like that.
History shows us that collectives are just as corruptible as individuals, and democracy can also infringe upon individual freedom in very intrusive ways, like taxation.
Now, like a lot of libertarians, think taxation is not valid under any circumstances, which is absolutely the most insane, because you're in a trap. Because if you're a libertarian who says taxation is never valid, then you're in a huge trap. Or if you say it's only valid if it's voluntary, like sales tax and things like that, then you're in a huge trap. But if you do what, like, say, Ayn Rand does and some other monarchist libertarians do, then it's an argument from proportion. It's like we're just in a discussion about when it's okay to tax people now. We're not it's not right or wrong. And libertarians want to make it, like, completely wrong. They really want to do it, make it black and white. It's stealing. That's what they want to say. Now, in Rousseau's version of society, which I kind of believe in, because of the autonomy part. Like, I really support the autonomy part, that you have more freedom within a society. So a person who makes $1 million a year who is taxed at, like, say, a 30% tax rate. That's what their tax rate ends up being in the end. Which there's marginal tax rates. A lot of people don't understand the marginal tax rate. If you make $1 million and the top marginal tax rate is everything over $800,000, and the tax rate for the top marginal tax rate is 30%, you're not taxed at 30% for your entire income. You're only taxed for your income over $800,000. I know for the people who already know that, that'll seem like I'm over-explaining it and treating you like a child, but there are conservatives who don't understand that. Like, I meet them all the time. They don't understand how the top marginal tax rate works. And conservatives like to talk about how they understand economics. And it's like, you don't even know how marginal tax rates work. How you know so much about economics? But the idea is that, yeah, if you're making $1 million and the government takes 30% of your money, then that's not hurting you the way that if you make $30,000 and the government takes 30% of your money. And if you're making $30,000, you're not paying 30. Depending on what your deductions are, you may not even be paying any taxes. Progressive taxation, like, it preserves freedom. It's not something that takes your freedom away. Because if you're making over $1 million a year, you are able to make $1 million a year because you function in a society. That's what you get from it.
Democracy also creates covert methods of indoctrinating people into believing they're free, like bipartisan politics.
Now, it's unclear to me whether Rocking Mr. E lives in the U.S. or the UK, because I've watched many of his videos and he changes which country he lives in depending on the video, and it's possible he relocate at some point, but the house is always the same, because almost all of his arguments tend to be about the US. And I don't know if he just thinks his audience is in the US, because people in England would laugh at this shit. Like, that's what I hear when I've shown his videos to British people and ask them what they think, and they're like, what would people in England think about someone who thinks this way? And they'd be like, we just laugh at him. He would be a clown. So I think he just knows most of his audience is in the US. I think he must live in the UK then. But in the UK, like, you actually have more political parties, whereas you have the Tories and you have the Labour Party and you have the Democratic Liberals and any number of other parties, the Socialist Party. You have more parties. Now, I do agree in the U.S., whenever you hear the word bipartisan deal, you're about to get screwed, because the only thing worse than the Republicans and the Democrats is when they work together. It's the only thing worse.
Many will argue, including Rousseau himself, that a well-educated populace creates a better standard of voter. But humans have limits of understanding, as well as individual desires. This means that some people might well become informed enough to make a direct democracy work, though others will lack the effort and cognitive ability to achieve this.
Now, what Rousseau and most socialists would say would make us have a better democracy is free college. Free college would help. That would help. Free education for everyone. That would really help a lot. Now, Rockin' Mr. E thinks that people are just stupid. Some people are just stupid and we can't do anything about it. It's true that some people are just stupid. He's living proof of that. But having actual free education helps. It helps a lot. Having government health care helps. It helps a lot. People wouldn't be as ignorant and as hateful if they actually had economic rights. So, I don't really buy what he's saying, but at the end he'll call leftists misanthropes. Is there anything more misanthropic than saying that democracy won't work because people are too stupid? Is there anything more misanthropic than that?
Plus, We've seen time and again how people will act for their own individual success above all. If this aligns with a collective goal, humans will, however, often cooperate. Democracy thus creates a zero-sum game, which might be better than a life or death struggle, but it's hardly the benevolent system that many would have us believe.
Now, he's basically supporting egoism. I should just make a whole video about egoism, because it would take me a whole video to really deal with it. He's making an argument from egoism. We always act in our own self-interest, which isn't true. Egoism is actually really easy to disprove, but it's hard to explain exactly why it's false, because egoism is one of those ideas where you can just linguistically change it so that people are always doing what's in their interests, or just like argue whatever anyone's doing is in their interest. Like, oh, they went and found their neighbor's dog for them. They were doing that totally in their own interest, because otherwise they would have felt bad about it. Like, that's just basically the egoist's argument, but it's easy to disprove if we go into it. Now, what he says here at the end, he calls it a zero-sum game, which would mean that anything that benefits me takes away from you, and anything that benefits you takes away from me. Now, that's not true. It's not true at all, because he doesn't understand the Rousseauian example of autonomy. It goes back to what I was talking about, freedom. Like, if you're more economically free, if you make $1 million, even if we took 50% of your money, you would still be more economically free than someone who makes $30,000 a year. You would. You'd be more economically free. So it's dumb. But like Rush Limbaugh, you sometimes made this stupid thing on his show when we were talking about the financial crisis and how the bankers basically robbed us all. And he was like, just because somebody loses money doesn't mean that someone else took it. As if, like, money just disappears. As it, like, there's only so much money. It's a note of promise of payment from the government. So if people lost a bunch of money, then someone else got it. That's what that means. So Rush Limbaugh is actually arguing the opposite point. That's the thing with these conservatives. Like, they'll change their argument to whatever they think will suit them at the time.
Democracy is also prone to co-option by third parties. Feminism, corporatism, and organized religion have repeatedly demonstrated how others can coercively push their agendas to the forefront.
I just have one question about this. How exactly would an anarcho-capitalist society avoid that? How? How would it avoid that?
Whenever someone insists on the validity of a social contract, I ask them to explain how an individual can legitimately be subjugated or enslaved upon their birth. As yet, I've received no answer that doesn't revert to appeals to popularity or other logical fallacies like appeals to authority and tradition. There's absolutely no logically consistent basis to state that human beings are obligated to obey a social contract if they have no say in the matter.
Once again, this is just him not understanding Rousseau. Like, obviously you're more free in a society. If you want to test the theory, then these libertarian islands these guys keep making, you can look them up, or keep promising to making these libertarian societies where you can go and be completely free and be a libertarian and not have any... I would love to see one get off the ground, and then it will burn to the ground in a week. Now, it's just a horrible option other than the social contract. It's really true. It's just an absolutely horrible option. Now, social contract is similar to deontological ethics, which I'm a deontologist, so I have certain sympathies toward it. One of the problems with the social contract as a basis for ethics is that it just encourages you to only value the people within your contract, like within your government. Tribalism, nationalism, things like that. It should be things that extend to the entire human race, like rights that extend to the entire human race. A lot of Americans seem to believe that they have unique rights that other countries don't have. It's kind of weird. So I see that problem. But like, there really isn't this huge problem that he thinks that there is, because you're more free. If not, then go away. Like, I would give libertarians, like, let's just give libertarians a whole state of their own. Let's give it to them. Here in the U.S., let's give it to them. I know it's never going to happen, it's not practical, but let's give it to them, and they will be whining to come back. Nozick, who is the most important libertarian philosopher probably, was a monarchist, and he said the only way you could get a monarchist state, though, is if you had a total breakdown of government, which is kind of funny because how did we get to the one we have now then? Because we did have like no government. Human beings had no government, and then they created one, and then we got to the one we got now. So his argument is basically like if we have an anarcho-capitalist society, then it would become a monarchist society anyway. I think if we became anarcho-capitalists on Monday, we would be monarchists by Friday. So I actually agree with Nozick on that, because we'd realize how utterly stupid it is to not have to have a government, and we would create a government by Friday. But then it would slowly become a more inclusive government, as long as like the people had some way, depending on what ways the people had to influence the government.
Even if they do, freedom is an unalienable right, which means it can't be taken away or restricted without resorting to authoritarianism or slavery.
He and I have totally different definitions of freedom, and I'm going to do, in order to address what he says here, I'm going to do a video on Nozick's Tale of the Slave. It'll be up soon. Probably before the next episode of Rocking Mr. E comes up, to illustrate that what he thinks is slavery is not slavery.
Many will then claim that freedom isn't a right, since it can be taken away with force. But those that attempt to do this are putting their own freedom at risk when the one in jeopardy defends themselves from being harmed, or seeks justice for being wronged.
And I was talking about the non-aggression principle in the previous video. I gave a couple ways that you could justify it and said that there's really not a libertarian way to justify it. He's doing it through a consequentialist way, which is the one I forgot. I forgot the consequentialist way, so I'm kind of embarrassed I forgot. He's doing consequentialist. It doesn't really work. Consequentialist attempts to justify the non-aggression principle because he's just basically saying, oh, well, if you attack someone, then you might get hurt. Well, what the fuck do I care if I'm way stronger than that person? Say I want to rape a woman, and she's 5 feet tall and 95 pounds, and she has no interest in having sex with me, and I rape her, then what's she going to do? Maybe scratch me a little? Like, maybe get a few licks in, but that's it. Like, and maybe I'm into that. So, exactly in the state of nature, what exactly stops me? Like, it's incredibly flawed to use a consequentialist version. Because maybe you just have weapons and they don't. That means that basically if I have weapons and they don't, I'm going to kill them and there's no one to tell the tale. There's nobody for them to go to like get help. There's no one to help them. That's why like westerns are filled with revenge stories, because there's minimal government out in the West, as it's portrayed in the movies, and so people can do what they want. Like the Wild West, it's like, is that really what you want to live? The Wild West wasn't really that wild though, but the way it's portrayed in the movies, like that's what absolutely no government would be like. At least they had law and order.
Many will try to deny that the social contract is often a soft version of slavery or subtle authoritarianism, but this is exactly what it consistently amounts to. While we live in a time when individual freedom is slowly improving, it seems there will always be misanthropes and sociopaths preferring to live in a world where human beings are treated as little more than cattle.
So, anarcho-capitalism. How would people not be treated as cattle then? Honestly, let's compare it to the Rousseau version. You live in a society, you get healthcare, you get schools, you get roads, you get libraries, you get public television, you get all these things that improve your life and improve your freedom. What exactly is superior about his version? So, in order to answer some of these questions that Rocking Mr. E brings up about government, I will be doing another episode about democracy, and also I will be doing a video that does not have anything to do with one of his videos about Nozick's Tale of the Slave very soon.